Hello again, everyone. Before we get started in just a few minutes, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping details for our virtual format. We just ask that everyone keep their cameras turned off and please remain muted to reduce background noise. We do have some visuals today, so we recommend that you select Speaker View in the top right-hand corner of your Zoom page in order to best see the presentations. Today's session will end with a Q&A. We ask that if you do not have any questions for our panelists, that you type and send them through the chat function at the bottom middle of your Zoom screen. If required, you can also send questions to info@enochturnerschoolhouse.ca. Again, that's info@enochturnerschoolhouse.ca. We do have closed captioning available for this session. These can be turned on by selecting closed captioning at the bottom right of the screen. And finally, today's session will be recorded. The video will be posted on our website at www.enochturnerschoolhouse.ca in 24 hours and can be shared and viewed again from there. And with that, I will pass things over to the president and chair of the Enoch Turner Schoolhouse Foundation, Lynn Carrillo.
Welcome everyone to the third session of Opening the Schoolhouse to All. The Foundation's mission is to share the story of the struggle for equal access to public education. In this series, we explore how access to publicly funded schooling has been expanded and what barriers remain. This evening, we present Doing the Right Thing, Disability, Autism, and Special Education. The chair is Sue Winton, an associate professor and undergraduate program director at the Faculty of Education at York University. She's a specialist in the study of educational policy, with a particular interest in the privatization of public education. Her publications have appeared in Canadian and international journals. She is co-editor with Jillian Parak of Critical Perspectives on Education Policy and Schools. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you very much, Lynn. And welcome to everybody who is joining us tonight for what I'm sure is going to be an excellent panel. I'm going to just take a moment to introduce our speakers, and then we'll get right down to hearing them. So our first speaker tonight is Jason Ellis. Jason Ellis is an associate professor of educational studies and a historian of education at the University of British Columbia. He's the author of A Class by Themselves, The Origins of Special Education in Toronto and Beyond. This award-winning book charts special education's growth from roots in eugenics and social reform a century ago to an essential yet perennial contested feature of the school system today. Ellis's most recent research examines education, opportunity, and inequality in Canada's post-war suburbs and their schools. He's also an editor of the journal Historical Studies in Education and a regular commentator on British Columbia's K-12 education in print, radio, and television media. Our second speaker tonight is Margaret Spoelstra. Margaret Spoelstra has served as Executive Director of Autism Ontario since 2001. For 39 years, she's worked with individuals with a variety of learning needs, but particularly with people with autism spectrum disorders. As an educator, she's engaged with children, teens, and adults, their families, and professionals and community leaders who support them in the US and Canada in educational, residential, and community settings. Prior to joining Autism Ontario, she worked in clinical and resource services for the Geneva Center for Autism, providing behavior and communication supports and ASD training across North America. She was appointed a member of the Order of Canada in 2011. Our third speaker this evening is Victoria Freeman. Victoria is a writer, theater artist, educator, and public historian. Her most recent book, A World Without Martha, a memoir of sisters, disability, and difference, explores the context as well as the personal, familial, and social consequences of the decision to institutionalize her sister because she had Down syndrome. With L'Arche Toronto Soul Express, a performance ensemble whose core members have intellectual disabilities, she created Birds Make Me Think About Freedom, a play about the history of institutionalization in Ontario, which premiered at the 2018 Toronto Fringe Festival. She's taught at York University and the University of Toronto in history, Indigenous studies, Canadian studies, and sociology. She is currently co-writing a treaty guide for Torontonians, an illustrated adult pop-up book for the 2021 Toronto Biennial of Art, as part of the ongoing Talking Treaties project of Jumblies Theatre and Arts. Finally, our fourth presenter is Jillian Parak. Dr. Jillian Parak is an assistant professor and Canada Research Chair in Inclusion, Disability, and Education within the Faculty of Education at York University. As a previous teacher in special education and research coordinator with the Toronto District School Board, she's conducted extensive system and school-based research in Toronto in the areas of structural equity, special education, and academic streaming. In particular, her work explores how schools construct and respond to disability, as well as how students are organized across programs and systems. So I'm sure you'll agree with me that this is a great lineup tonight. And each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes, and then this will be followed by an exchange among the panelists in response to audience questions. So you keep your questions coming in, and I will receive them and then direct them to the panelists once they've all had an opportunity to speak. So at this time, I'd like to invite Jason Ellis to present.
Thanks. Many historical accounts of exceptional children's education talk about a move from segregation to integration to inclusion that has unfolded over the past 100 years. In this narrative, public schools are moving progressively closer to the just outcome of history, full inclusion of children with disabilities in regular schools and classrooms. And implicit in this is a judgment that anything less than full inclusion is simply on the wrong side of history. And yet in this talk, I will show that this view of history is too narrow and that it has overshadowed and obscured other struggles for educational justice for exceptional children. I will identify one or two of those struggles and discuss their histories. Finally, I will argue that over-relying on a historical narrative of segregation to integration to inclusion causes us to miss opportunities to achieve justice for all children with disabilities. There is, despite its limitations, still much truth in the segregation to integration to inclusion narrative. It is true that when reformers in Toronto and Vancouver started Canada's first special education classes in the 1910s, that their interest was in segregating children with disabilities from the rest. Some of these reformers were even eugenicists who believed in a now debunked theory that people they called, quote, mental defectives, unquote, threatened the survival of the human race as they knew it. One of these reformers, a medical doctor and leading proponent of special education named Helen McMurtry, had this to say in 1910, quote, "Nature has put the mental defective in a class by himself. We had better take the hint," unquote. Now, McMurtry and other eugenicists like her wanted to use special education classrooms as what they called, quote, clearinghouses, unquote. The classes could isolate young mental defectives until they became adults. Then mental defectives would be transferred to farm colonies that they could not leave and that would segregate them for life. This way, people that eugenicists believed were inferior could be prevented from ever producing offspring. Eugenics helped to define the segregation era of special education that began in the 1910s and lasted until the second half of the 20th century. However, by the second half of the 20th century, parents in particular began to challenge the segregated approach to exceptional children's education. Associations for Retarded Children, ARCs, disputed the legal exclusion of their boys and girls from public schools altogether. Parents of disabled pupils who did get to attend regular schools but were shunted into so-called opportunity special education classes and special education vocational high schools challenged these segregated dead-end programs. And these parents won policy victories in the integration era that spanned the 1950s to the 1990s. In Ontario, Bill 82 in 1980 answered the demands of ARCs by prohibiting school boards from excluding so-called, quote, mentally retarded, unquote, children. Alongside Bill 82, school boards across the country also mainstreamed thousands of other exceptional children who had previously attended public schools, but who were housed in separate special education classrooms. Then came inclusion in the 2000s. It was not enough to put exceptional children in regular schools and classrooms. Schools and classrooms should also welcome these youngsters through an approach in which one Ontario policy document stated in 2009, quote, "Students see themselves reflected in their curriculum, their physical surroundings, and the broader environment in which diversity is honored and all individuals are respected," unquote. In this historical trajectory, Canadian schools moved from segregation, the 1910s to 1950s, to integration, 1950s to 1990s, to inclusion in the 2000s. But, as I'll show in a moment, this view of educational history, while not necessarily incorrect, is limited and limiting. When researching my book on the history of special education, I found many stories that did not fit into the narrative of segregation to integration to inclusion. One of those stories that doesn't fit is about access to appropriate instruction. Another is a story about language rights in the case of children who are deaf. And yet another story involves paraeducational services, things that schools provide like speech therapy. These are all worthy examples, but the one that I want to concentrate on in the following is access to appropriate instruction. In the 1920s, the Toronto Board of Education put in place several more new types of special education classes. While the classes were segregated, school officials did not intend them as, quote, clearinghouses, unquote, obedient to a eugenics policy. They did not intend them as dead-end non-academic programs to hide exceptional children out of the way either. So-called sight-saving classes that the Toronto Board of Education established in 1921, for example, were designed to provide appropriate instruction to children who had vision problems. In particular, the sight-saving classes offered modified high school level instruction that, by 1932, permitted students to do the same work that students in regular high schools did, and to sit the same provincial departmental examinations. There were also special classes for children with physical disabilities in Toronto by 1926. These classes were in a school and classrooms that the school board modified to make accessible to children who wheeled or used crutches. They also offered appropriate instruction that enabled students to do high school work and sit departmental examinations. And I found considerable evidence that the children and parents involved with sight saving and other similar classes embraced them, though not every family did. As just one example, the popular Canadian children's author, Jean Little, went to sight-saving classes in Toronto around 1940. She later wrote in her 1987 autobiography that she preferred them to the mainstream classrooms she had also attended. Sight-saving and other classes like them helped to deliver appropriate instruction to Little and others, instruction that permitted them to obtain a further education. The struggle for appropriate instruction has not gone away as schools have moved from segregation to integration to inclusion in recent years. The Moore case in British Columbia, to which I will now turn, is an example of this. Jeffrey Moore was attending a segregated program in the North Vancouver School District in 1994, where he received appropriate instruction for his dyslexia. The district closed the class. Jeffrey's parents filed a complaint with the British Columbia Human Rights Commission. The Moores and their lawyers argued Jeffrey required a specific intervention for dyslexia that a teacher could only deliver in a separate setting. The Moores took their struggle for appropriate instruction for Jeffrey to the Supreme Court of Canada. In 2012, that court ruled unanimously in the Moores' favor. By not offering Jeffrey a specific intervention in a separate setting, the district had violated Jeffrey's charter right to equal access to education. While the court had little to say about inclusion directly, it did state that school districts have to offer, quote, a range of services, unquote, for exceptional children. This can include inclusion, but a district's policy cannot consist only of inclusion, the Supreme Court effectively said. And so segregation to integration to inclusion is one story of exceptional children's education, one important story, but it is not the story. Squeezing all history into the segregation, integration, inclusion narrative forces all students, past and present, into a single struggle. Instead, we must recognize and accept that there are multiple struggles. This is true of the past and the Moore's campaign for appropriate instruction for Jeffrey in a separate setting, or the campaigns that educators and families in Toronto joined in the 1920s for sight saving and other classes. When we obsess on setting, segregated or inclusive, we risk missing these campaigns for what they really were, different struggles, not about place, but about exceptional children's education nonetheless. The existence of more than one struggle is true of the present also. To fulfill Jeffrey Moore's charter right to equal education, to achieve educational justice for him and other children like him, means that we must recognize a multitude of demands that exceptional students place on schools today. These demands are not all about setting, segregated or inclusive. Achieving educational justice also means seeing a range of policies, inclusion but not inclusion alone, to answer equitably the quite varied educational demands exceptional children place on schools. Inclusion is not and cannot be the end outcome of history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. I'd now like to invite Mark Spoelstra to take the floor.
Hi there. You can hear me, right?
Okay. You can.
Great. What do you think about when you hear the word autism? What feelings or ideas come to your mind? Is it something puzzling, something to be feared or embraced, or something that is understood but doesn't really tell you much about the person to whom the word is attached? The word autism has not really been around all that long, only about 75 years. In some cultures or languages, there isn't even a word for autism. We can think of autism as a diagnosis given by a doctor, a word that's a part of a required checkbox for funding for services, or as describing certain human characteristics, or even as a word in a title of a movie. Whatever the case, our awareness of autism has exploded in the last 30 years. There have been endless debates about the language used to describe this thing called autism. You may have heard people use autism spectrum disorder, ASD, autism spectrum condition, autistic, ASPE, which is a reference to a previous diagnostic label for something called Asperger's, on the autism spectrum, or having autism. As we learn more about the genetics of autism, some people have been thinking about autisms with an S on the end, which allows us to think of autism more like a person's thumbprint, truly their own and like no other. None of these terms are wrong, but they each reflect our changing understanding of what autism means or not, and how a person thinks about themselves or how they wish to identify with autism. To complicate matters further, we also know that autism occurs more often with other conditions that have their own names, like developmental delay, anxiety disorder, epilepsy, or other mental health conditions. These words may also present in a variety of reports that health or education professionals produce before or following a child's or adult's medical or educational assessment. For a parent who first hears autism raised as a possible reason for their child's development in a particular way, these previous observations may not be at all important in that moment. What they want to know is, what does this mean? What will my child be all right? And what do I or my family need to do about this information to help my child to be healthy and happy in our family and in our community? And will they have friends? Family, community, and culture all play important roles together in understanding what autism means or doesn't mean, and how we think about a child and the gift that they are within these contexts and beyond. How does autism rate among all the important characteristics of who a child is? Or how does it help us to understand a person or their value within a family or community? When does it matter, and who decides? The answers to these questions are not easy, and the answers, like autism itself, will change over time and in different situations. One autistic child may be very bright, but may not have the ability to use spoken words to describe what they experience. Some of autism's characteristics may help a person to be highly focused or attentive to details. Depending on the environment where the person is located at a given time, These abilities or differences may or may not be a barrier for participating or to be included. For example, the highly focused child may thrive when playing a video game, but that same focus may become a challenge that results in a lot of anxiety in a large socially demanding gathering like a birthday party or a school group. An autistic adult may be highly focused in a work environment that requires precision, may be exactly what is needed at that time, but if that same degree of precision needs to be applied to coping with a new social situation, it can be quite daunting. Context or environment matters with autism. What we've learned is that what we do understand, one person's autism may result in a different responses than to another child's or adult's autism. The questions we ask must always lead to better understanding of this person and the choices we make to accept that person for who they are while providing supports and opportunities needed to thrive. That often takes changes in our own thinking and actions rather than trying to change the autistic person to be someone they are not. To do that means looking at the whole person and not defining or restricting them to terms like autism that we have created as a societal construct. Because of the explosive growth of autism, there have been many Ontario Ministry of Education initiatives and from various parties over the years, struggling to manage the growing numbers of students diagnosed on the autism spectrum and applying necessary and appropriate educational resources. Many of these initiatives have been important steps forward and created with genuine community input. Funding and resources have been applied for hiring additional educators, for training, for policy reform that is specific to autism and students with neurodevelopmental differences. These things have all had an impact. Nevertheless, fundamental changes to education in Ontario are needed when it comes to teaching Ontario students. We have much of the language in our province's education bills and policies, but we have not yet made the necessary systemic changes that will provide students with the resources they need when they need them. These include access to appropriate classroom settings, a diversity of classroom settings, educators and assistants who understand and can accurately assess the individual learning needs of autistic students and are specifically trained and supervised by professionals who can provide direct coaching to ensure educational strategies achieve identified learning and IEP goals, and that progress is meaningful and regularly reviewed by a team that includes supervisors, educators, parents, and any other relevant and regulated professionals whose input supports the increased likelihood of achieving the child's learning objectives. If we took the word autism or autistic out of these last statements and simply replaced it with student, we would likely agree that this is what every student in Ontario should have a right to. We would rarely, if ever, need to use a diagnostic label to determine if specialized funding or other supports are needed in school settings. Instead, we should always be asking only, what is necessary for this child to best learn in this particular environment and at this time in their life? Sadly, we are seeing many families having to resort to more and more human rights cases and legal options to ensure that their child receives what they are already entitled to in Ontario schools. These cases are financially and emotionally draining to families who have exhausted their resources to mandate the boards to do what is already promised to them in existing educational policies. Because of the individualized needs of autistic students, and more recently because of the pandemic, a spotlight has been focused more closely on gaps in our education system. So what is needed? In our minds, a complete review of special education in Ontario, that boards of education work to work collaboratively with external professionals within schools and in community settings where the learning needs of the child is in the most supportive environment and is central to everyone's work. That pre-service training in things like applied behavior analysis be made mandatory for all educators, not just about autism, so that these kinds of trainings on how to manage classrooms and how to understand one's own behavior in an educational setting is clearly understood. And that the education recommendations in the October 2019 Ontario Autism Programs Advisory Panel recommendations be reviewed by a joint Ministry of Education, Community and Social Services, Ministry of Health, and colleges and training come together to look at those recommendations which were clearly identified by the community for education. At the same time, we also continue to learn more about what helps people on the autism spectrum to grow and learn. We know that supporting families to raise their autistic child and to be participants in all decisions that will influence that child's development is so important. We know that it takes additional community resources in early childhood development, health, education, and recreation to help a community to raise children with autism and other neurodiverse learning needs. What is most important is that we see a person, a child, a teen, an adult, loved and valued, with strengths and needs like every other constantly developing human being. We also need to help people on the autism spectrum and their families to tell their own stories and not to be measured by others' experience of living with autism. How does being Indigenous also inform how one thinks about autism? Helping a person on the autism spectrum to live with dignity in whatever community they are in is a fundamental human right. When we make these investments in people in our communities, perhaps what we describe as autism will not define who they are or who they become as contributing members of society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marg. I'd like to now invite Victoria Freeman to give her presentation, which is entitled "Shut Up, Kid: An Education in Institutionalized Disability."
Thank you very much, Sue. Thank you, Enoch's Turner School Foundation. It's really an honor to be asked to participate. Although I'm a historian, I'm not a scholar of disability. I've written a very personal memoir about my family's experience. And that's really what I'm going to be speaking from tonight. And please bear in mind that I'm speaking mainly about an earlier era, but I think and I'm speaking mainly about exclusion, but I think you'll see some parallels. So I'm going to start with an image. I'm going to tell my story in 3 photographs. And this is the first one. My sister Martha was born with Down syndrome in 1958 and was institutionalized at the age of 20 months when I was 4 years old. A photo from my sister's institutional file shows her 2 months after she was admitted, held in anonymous arms, looking up into the camera with a bewildered expression on her face. I cannot imagine what it was like for her to be removed from everything and everyone she knew at this extremely young age, to be so completely abandoned. For people who have grown up in today's climate of increased acceptance of people with intellectual disabilities, it may be hard to understand the parents of earlier times who made the decision to put their children in institutions. But in 1960, there were almost no community supports for keeping children at home, and parents were told that they would be damaging their other children if they did. The decision to institutionalize my sister Martha was made on the advice of doctors who told them that segregated care was the best care available. But it was also a rejection of my sister because she had Down syndrome and was based on the social prejudices and the systemic discrimination of the time. We children were shaped by our parents' attitudes and by the unspoken rules of what could be spoken about or not spoken about. Sadly, during her lifetime, we mainly saw my sister's disability and not the full person she was. Like the residential school system for Indigenous children, the system of institutionalizing people who had developmental disabilities was a deeply flawed model of care based on terribly damaging and incorrect assumptions. In this case, many of them originating in eugenics and in prejudicial concepts of the normal. Institutionalization was fundamentally unjust because it denied people their families, their homes, and their freedom. They lived basically incarcerated lives, working in unfree conditions, were congregated, segregated, isolated. Institutionalization was a system that broke up families rather than offering support for them. Essentially the same problem we still have with the foster care system in Canada today. This is not to say that there were not kind people working in those institutions, but as with residential schools, the fact that an individual resident's experience might have been more positive, or a particular caregiver might have been kind or loving, does not undo the whole picture, the big picture, the systemic issues. I should add that although such institutions were closed in 2009 in Ontario, similar institutions are still operating in several other provinces to this day. Like orphanages, mental hospitals, and long-term care homes, at least of the era in which I grew up, these were what Irving Goffman called total institutions, where staff had total control over people's lives and little oversight, where physical, sexual, and emotional abuse and neglect easily flourished. There were frequent outbreaks of communicable diseases and many deaths. There are so many stories I could tell, so much trauma that survivors and their families carry to this day. I remember my own terror visiting Rideau as a young child, being swarmed and grabbed by kids waiting in the hall outside the cafeteria. Only years later did I realize that they were desperate for love, for contact, and for attention. I had loved my sister before she was put in the institution, and I suffered deep trauma when she was sent away. But I learned, my education, was that people with intellectual disabilities had nothing to offer society and didn't belong there. They were defined by their lack. They were seen as less than fully human. Their dignity and freedom didn't matter. It was shameful to have such a person in your family, best out of sight, out of mind. Yet, disability is not a shameful aberration, and it shouldn't be hidden away. It's the most normal thing there is. Most of us, as I'm sure many of you know, will be disabled at some point in our lives, and besides, we're all part of this human family. Our more vulnerable sisters and brothers deserve the best care, not the cheapest and the shoddiest. My sister lived at Rideau for 13 years. We visited her there occasionally, and once in a while, she came home for a short visit. But these were excruciating visits made out of duty, not love. I'm haunted by a second photo of my sister, Martha, taken at the institution in 1970, when she was almost 12. She stares defiantly at the camera. You can see her struggle to survive in that harsh environment and her incredible strength, determination, and resistance. This was a sister I never knew. I don't know what happened to her at Rideau, but in her file, a social worker commented that she didn't have the trust in adults that most children have. To the best of my knowledge, my parents never considered that she might be mistreated in the institution. But the first full sentence that we ever heard her speak was when my little baby brother was crying in his room after he woke up from a nap. My sister she knocked on the door and she shouted, "Shut up, kid." Rideau was a huge institution of about 50 buildings on a sprawling and isolated site, with a population then of about 2,600 residents. It was very overcrowded and underfunded, and the staff weren't very well trained. So perhaps it's no surprise that that was what my sister learned about how you should react when children cry. After a Rideau resident killed himself on a work placement at a local farm, there was a call for an inquiry. The groundbreaking 1971 Williston Report recommended that the large Ontario institutions be closed, a recommendation that would not be fully carried out until 2009, 38 years later. However, in response to increasing pressure to reintroduce at least some residents into community settings, in 1973, my then 15-year-old sister was sent to live in an approved boarding home in another city. Luckily, she was informally adopted by the woman who ran it, living as a member of her family, even after the boarding home closed. In fact, for 29 years, until my sister's death in 2002, this woman, my sister's savior and protector, loved my sister as no one else ever had. Miraculously, my sister found the love and acceptance she never received from her birth parents or the institution or even from me. And in many ways, she flourished, despite her very difficult early years. The change in my sister was immediate and profound. She found her voice. She began to talk and laugh far more than she ever had before. Her transformation is evident in a photo taken a few years later. Let's just find it. She's wearing a beautiful dress and pearls and looks confident, relaxed, and completely at ease with herself. This speaks to the crucial role that community support can play in the healing of trauma and the blossoming of previously stunted lives. Although even that could not make up for some of the things she did not receive earlier in life, it was clear to all who saw her that living in the community and in a family, even if not ours, was a huge improvement in her life. In fact, the social worker who visited her several times in her new home remarked that it seemed the intelligence tests that had been administered at Rideau had seriously underestimated her intelligence. This comment haunts me and speaks to the life that she might have lived had she been loved and nourished from the start in her own family. Although, sadly, we didn't know how to love her, and we so severely underestimated her. In speaking with other siblings, I've discovered that many of us were deeply affected by our parents' decision to institutionalize our brothers and sisters, and by our witnessing of and sometimes participation in their dehumanization. Many of us have never spoken of our experiences to anyone. Many of us feared that we would also be cast out of our families or out of the human race if we weren't smart enough or good enough, or if we were different. I certainly struggled with that as a queer and genderqueer person. We learned that only some people, normal people, were truly worthy of love. As Ian Hacking, philosopher of science, comments in The Social Construction of What, the word normal was, quote, one of the most powerful ideological tools of the 20th century. So institutionalization isn't just about big buildings. It's about isolating, segregating, congregating, and denying people with intellectual disabilities the right to participate in their families and communities, denying them freedom and choice and the best possible flourishing. I know that COVID is re-isolating and re-segregating children with disabilities, that family supports are not there, that there is the threat of the gains made over decades in inclusive education and inclusion in society being eroded. I hope my comments help to make clear why this must not happen. Finally, I leave you with one rather different image of my sister. I will tell you that she swam like an otter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. That was very moving. I'd like to turn now to our fourth presenter, Jillian Parak, who will talk to us about her paper entitled Disability Studies, Special Education, and the Experience of Schooling.
Great. Thank you, Sue, and thank you very much for that, Victoria. I'm just going to open this up and share my screen here. Hopefully that fills your screen on your end as well. Thank you so much for having me here today. This panel has been tremendous, and I just really appreciate being a part of it. Disability studies in education is a growing field of study and offers a useful framework when exploring issues of equity, particularly as they relate to disability in schools. One of the goals of disability studies in education is to look at educational processes and practices through a disability justice lens. My work in educational research has primarily focused on systems in which ability is central. And this would include special education, academic streaming, and specialized programming. I'm primarily concerned with how ability is constructed and responded to in schools. Disability studies in education explores how students are evaluated, referred, and identified through special education, as well as how students are organized in schools. A lot of the work in the field focuses on how students are included or excluded within their classrooms and or within peer groups, whether or not students experience value as equal members of the school community, as well as whether students achieve equitable academic, social, and experiential opportunities and outcomes. And because disability studies urges us to challenge how we typically think about ability, it also explores the intersectional role that race, gender, and sexuality, along with class and community-based factors, play in the construction of disability and disability identity. So with the time that we have today, I thought I'd just quickly go over 3 areas that disability studies in education asks us to consider and relate them to some research. The research I'll be presenting was conducted either while I was working at the Toronto District School Board as a research coordinator or in partnership with the TDSB from York University. So, all right, so firstly, disability studies in education asks us to problematize and challenge how we think about ability. So instead of thinking about impairment as an individual issue, disability studies asks us to consider how the conditions in which students are learning are either enabling or disabling their capacity to demonstrate particular skills. And as research has shown, how we perceive ability is vulnerable to bias and can be conflated with students' racial, gender, and class identities. We know that racial identity, particularly Black, Indigenous, and Latinx students, as well as students from lower income households, are more likely to experience discrimination through the presumption of lower capacity for learning. Conversely, students who identify as white or East Asian or from higher wealth families are more likely to be privileged through gifted and talented designations. So I'll show you a quick slide here. This study was from 2019, and my colleagues, Dr. Rob Brown, Samuel Zhang, and I published, that was looking at students' reported learning skills and the proportion of students who were recorded as having excellent learning skills across racial groups. And for the particular group in the red circle there, these students were achieving at or above the provincial standard in mathematics, yet how their learning skills were evaluated and reported varied tremendously. Study results showed that white students were significantly more likely to be evaluated as having excellent learning skills compared to other racial groups, Black students being the least likely, despite all of these students having achieved at the same level. And in cases was an anomaly in the data, our colleague Samuel ran this analysis across reading and writing and over various years, all revealing, resulting in the same pattern. And these outcomes have really significant implications on students' access to academic opportunities in school. And as mentioned, we know that these perceptions can become formalized through program opportunities, which in turn, as Domina Penner and Penner discuss, produce categorical inequality. And they state, and I quote, educational categories such as special education, gifted and international baccalaureate coursework, extracurricular activities that operate within schools reinforce and co-construct racial categories. And this allows schools to make organizational decisions that appear, quote, race neutral, but have disparate racial consequences. And this is one example of how forms of discrimination that may appear to be separate from ability can be enacted through how we construct ability and subsequently organize students. Secondly, disability studies in education asks us to consider how we understand disability identity. And this gets kind of tricky because most educational systems have an institutionalized process for referring students to special education support, as well as identifying either exceptionality or disability. But how disability or exceptionality are identified institutionally may not at all reflect how students perceive themselves. It can be argued that disability in education is largely understood through a deficit lens. So it should come as no surprise that this particular framing of disability produces disability discrimination in schools. And from our qualitative work, students have shared with us how being identified or associated with special education has not only negatively shaped their self-perception, but has also negatively shaped their social relationships in school. They reported being harassed and excluded by their peers. And although not using the word stigma directly, students certainly spoke to the effects of stigma produced by being perceived as incapable or as falling short of expectations. But to be honest, there is a lot of work to be done in schools to tackle ableism and disability discrimination. When we think about social justice education, disability is not usually top of mind. There have been studies that show that disability is often a forgotten element of social justice discourses and practices in schools. And when we look at what actions could be taken, we have to ask ourselves, are they being taken? For example, are schools prioritizing hiring disabled teachers, intentionally including disabled voices in curriculum, teaching disabled histories, or committing to creating disability positive spaces that celebrate disability identity? And maybe this is happening in some educational spaces, but it certainly is not widespread. And perhaps this contributes to why there is such a disconnect between how schools and students even conceptualize the identification of disability. So here is one more data slide. In another recently published study conducted with Dr. Rob Brown, you'll hear his name a few times in this presentation, we do a lot of work together. We uncovered that of students identified through special education, not including students identified as gifted, that overall, only a small proportion actually self-identified as having a disability. And we looked over a 10-year span and found that proportions were pretty consistent. And in both 2006 and 2007 and 2016 and 17, fewer than a third of students in special education actually self-identified as having a disability. There were significant differences found between institutional and self-identification across exceptionality categories for sure, as well as across student sociodemographic characteristics like gender, race, sexuality, and so on. But also from our work on this study, we discovered that there's a substantive population of students that do self-identify as having a disability, but are not involved in any way with special education. So overall, there was just a tremendous disconnect. All right, so lastly, disability studies in education asks us to think about how we respond to disability and organize students in schools. And much like institutional identification through special education, a placement in a special education program can also shape how students' capacity is perceived by others. And again, there can be significant implications to placement within certain types of self-contained special education programs. So this is the last study I'll show you, again, conducted with Dr. Rob Brown. But we, for this one, explored the proportion of students accessing grade 9 academic courses across elementary placements. And one thing we've discovered in our work is that access to grade 9 academic courses in Ontario is key to ensuring future access to post-secondary education. And what we found in this study is that, again, holding achievement constant, so all the kids on this screen have the same achievement, students who achieved at or above the provincial average on EQAO and had no involvement with special education, so the maroon bar, entered grade 9 academic at a rate of close to 90%, compared to fewer than 20% for students in a self-contained this particular self-contained special education program, which is the orange bar. So even again, though the achievement of these students was relatively similar. So these results urge us to think about how we organize students in schools and the implications of these organizational structures. So to wrap up, disability studies asks us to identify and challenge disabling practices and to reconceptualize how ability is understood in schools, addressing how we frame certain skills and capacities, how our own positionality informs our evaluation of others, how we understand impairment or identity, and how we determine placement for students are all areas that we as educators can engage in to shift the conditions in schools towards greater disability justice. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jillian. Okay, well, there's lots to think about here. And I do see that a number of questions have been submitted, and I'm going to do my very best to ask all of the questions that come in, but I am going to be keeping my eye on the time. We have about 40 minutes or so. As it stands right now, a lot of the questions seem to be directed at at individual speakers. So I'll start by identifying the person to whom the question was posed, but then invite the other panelists to weigh in if they have some further thoughts about the issue that's been addressed. So the first would be to Mark, and this person asks, well, what is your view, and as well the view of others on the panel, about providing direct autism therapy within a classroom setting, as opposed to the mostly consultative strategy now used in Ontario?
So that's a key question, and it was part of the recommendations that I suggested in my presentation, is that we need to bring all the people who can support that child's learning together in the place where they spend most of their time, which for kids should be in school. But it means that sometimes we're going to need to bring in extra resources from people who bring other regulated professions to help that student learn to the best of their ability. Teachers can't be all those things, but you should be able to work together with those professionals in the classroom setting. So if that's intervention, treatment approaches, those can all be done within an educational context. And there's been some progress towards that in trying to do that in a pilot way in the schools. And so the pandemic really just changed us on that and moving that forward. But that's where we need to go and stop putting up unnecessary barriers to a child's education and professionals supporting one another.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to contribute there? Okay, well, we'll move right along. Jason, this one's for you. How did the creation of inclusive education dovetail with the expanding public school system of the 1960s? And was there any opposition to inclusion?
I wouldn't necessarily periodize what I call inclusion to the 1960s. I think it's something that came a little bit later, but you may be referring to mainstreaming. I think the main motive force behind that was parents, especially organized parents in things like associations for quote unquote retarded children. There were also a greater Canadian awakening to human rights and equity in that period as well, and that had an effect. And certainly there was opposition. Sometimes it was opposition from the very people who had called for segregated settings before that. Other times it was from other parents, from teachers and teacher unions. Yeah, and a wide variety of others, not to single those particular ones out.
Thank you. Victoria, a viewer asks, what has been the personal response to your book? Have individuals and families that dealt with institutionalization responded? And were their experiences similar to yours?
It's been so amazing. Yes, I've heard from lots of people who have been affected by institutionalization, particularly other siblings, because until recently, we really haven't talked very much from our perspective about what happened to our siblings affected us, and what we learned from the whole experience, because we were often caught between parents and our sibling in uncomfortable ways. So yes, I've heard especially from siblings, but parents as well. And I've been involved with Family Alliance's Ontario's project Uncovering the People's History, which is, we organized an event specifically for siblings that was held in December, which was really the first time that I know of, and that people there knew of siblings getting together to share their experiences. So yeah, I've had lots of great responses from people, and it certainly connected me to lots of other people. We've had very diverse experiences, but there's a recognition of a common experience as well.
Thank you. Jillian, here's one for you. This person asks, begins by stating, the contrast between EQAO tests and learning skills ratings done by teachers is concerning. What is also concerning is that such difference in assessments goes back pre-EQAO testing. Has the ministry noticed these discrepancies, and are they responding?
Sorry. Sorry, I've lost you. Okay, here you're back. Yeah, actually, that's a great question, and it's interesting because I know there's been a lot of talk about the social emotional learning skills within the new mathematics curriculum, and whether or not it's an appropriate evaluation space, because they very much mirror the learning skills. And the fear is that there could be opportunity to integrate bias within students' mathematics marks. So I know that there has been some discussions around that, but yeah, we'll have to wait and see in terms of what eventually comes down the pipe.
Thanks. Okay, let's see. Mark, I'm going to start this specific question to you, but then I hope that perhaps others might weigh in, because the theme is really around advocacy for change. So, here, Mark, the question is, to begin, what are your thoughts on the government regulating the ABA occupation in order to make it easier for ABA therapy to be applied in schools? How actively is Autism Ontario advocating on this issue? And
Okay.
I would add, how does the advocacy take place and what makes it effective in your view, and then in the view perhaps of the other panelists as well?
Sure. Well, to me, advocacy has always been the voice of families and individuals themselves that is the most powerful. So whenever those voices are heard, that's the best. And the way that we advocate is we tend to gather information from parents so that we have a mixture of voices across the province through a survey. And it's interesting because our survey just from prior to the pandemic, where we had thousands of parents respond, told us that still, out of all the issues in autism, education is still the #1 issue. And those school years, because there are so many needs that are not being addressed. So those are the messages that we are advocating about very directly. You can find some of that material on our website. We share that information with the Ministry of Education. And we also empower parents to be the best voices for their children in school settings. And we speak with ministers of finance and with the ministers of education over the years, and directly express these concerns and results of our surveys so that they understand the wide range of need and what it means to live in the far north compared to Toronto or Windsor or Ottawa, in terms of experiences, what are common experiences and what are ones that need to be addressed more within the special education framework. But I want to get back to your original question, and that was, just if you could repeat that for me, Sue, the very beginning piece.
Sure. It was, what are your thoughts on the government regulating the ABA occupation in order to make it easier for ABA therapy to be applied in schools?
Right. So I think absolutely we need regulation of applied behavior analysis. Right now it's regulated through the US and not here in Canada. So that makes it odd, like compared to, say, a speech language pathologist whose regulation, or an occupational therapist whose regulation is here in Ontario, in the province in which you practice. But for ABA, that's very necessary. Having said that, we also need to think about a broader system of those types of learning skills and behavioral supports, so that we don't price ourselves out of gaining access to good people who, if they are well supervised in behavior analysis and in thinking about how to help kids learn to the best of their ability, we need a framework that will allow that to happen. But the first thing is to get the field regulated. And then how does that apply in an educational setting? So how can we do that by either on an interim basis, bringing those folks into classroom settings, but ultimately that education should also have people who have this skill as a fundamental part of their experience as teachers, and thinking about that more broadly and not just about autism, but as ABA, which is, when you think about it, is really understanding behavior and responding to it, not as something punitive, which is part of some of its history, and is simply not the case when it's done the way that it's intended.
Thanks, Mark. Any thoughts from the other panelists around the issue of advocacy in relation to some of the issues that you've touched on in your presentations?
I think the charter has changed it enormously, right? Before the charter, parents could advocate and they went to school boards and they exposed things through journalistic accounts, and then there's the Pierre Burden exposés in the 60s. But now the courts really have their backs in a sense that they can seek remedies. The Moore case that I talked about isn't just about inclusive education. In fact, it's not mainly about that. It turns on the individual's right to access equal education, and that has implications that are wide across all sorts of fields: racial discrimination in education, inclusion, a variety of different areas. And we're yet to sort of see all of those issues play out to their full conclusion through the courts, but I think we will see that in the future.
I can add something too here. I think when I think about advocacy, I think that faculties of education also have a role to play in terms of preparing educators as they leave and go out into schools to be able to be that advocate for students within a school. So that requires, having a really in-depth understanding of the system that they're going into, of the special education system, of what rights students have as learners, what obligations they have as educators, like all of those components, so that they can really advocate on behalf of their students.
I'll just say a couple of words about my own path in advocacy, which has not been an academic one, but through the arts. And I've worked in creating the play Birds Make Me Think About Freedom. I worked with a group of actors from L'Arche who are amazing and wonderful, and it was so healing for me to work with them. But it was very interesting because we worked first with survivors, and then from them, the actors who were part of the performance troupe had not been in institutions themselves, but they became advocates for for survivors and for families and everybody else. And one of them said, this could have been me. They knew that. And so it was really powerful. We've performed that play in London for the 10th anniversary of the closing of the institutions a couple of years ago. And we were going to take it to Ottawa when the pandemic hit. We do have it on video. For anybody who's interested, you can contact me. But I think the arts are very powerful in the kind of work that I am doing. It's not as specific to education. It's broader public education.
Thank you, everyone. I have another question here that's posed to everybody in the group. The question is this: is our changing understanding of disability and acknowledgement of ableism moving in our education system moving in the right direction? And is it fast enough?
Hi, great question. And I'm an optimist, so I'm going to say yes. I think that there has been movement around acknowledging ableism and disability discrimination in schools. Is it fast enough? Never, and I don't know if it ever could be. But I just want to throw a shout out to the Toronto District School Board. They have been, a lot of the research that I presented today was done through partnership with them. And they have been an incredible institution in terms of responding to the research and have an incredible staff and leadership team that have really galvanized around ideas around taking down barriers for students, particularly in the areas of special education and academic streaming. There's a lot of incredible schools that are out there doing work that is challenging the norms around how we think about ability within schools. And so, yeah, it is happening. Can't be fast enough, but it is happening.
Does the arc of history bend towards justice? I mean, the answer in my talk was no, not necessarily, though I'd still like to think that it does, but history doesn't move in any particular direction. Or not in a progressive one anyway. The present is not more progressive than the past necessarily. So no, sorry, I'd like it to.
Okay, Marg or Victoria, anything to add there? Okay, well, that's fine. We have some other questions here. Okay, this is a question for Victoria. The person who posed the question first said, thank you for your moving contribution. How can we support children with disabilities and their families whose primary caregivers deny the presence of a disability or refuse to educate themselves on the child's needs?
Whoa, this is totally outside my experience. Because my experience was the complete opposite, that everything emphasized the disability to the exclusion of all else. I feel like other people may have a much better response than I do to that particular question. My experience with parents and what I've seen with a lot of other families is parents were perhaps in denial about the complicated family dynamics that institutionalization created. And I think there were a lot of things that happened in families that are unrecognized. And there certainly was a culture of silence in a lot of families where you couldn't ask your parents lots of questions.
Thank you. Your presentation response, and as well as others, really speak to the context, the social context, and the influence of the issues of which we are speaking. Okay, I'm going to ask a question to Jason in particular, but I'm going to ask everybody on the panel to think about if you might have any comments on what you heard from the other speakers. So while you're thinking, Jason, here's a question for you. And I don't know, other people might want to weigh on this question as well. Can you comment on the benefit of inclusion for the included students' classmates? That is potentially building of empathy, understanding, lessening of bullying, etc.
This isn't my area, it's Jillian's, but the research that I've read is that it's usually considered enormously beneficial to students who are not disabled. People have made that argument for a long time. People made that argument in the 30s and 40s in the context of, should we have separate special education classrooms in high schools? Yes, we should. And one of the reasons we should is that high school kids who tend to bully others will learn to take pity, quote unquote, on the weaker child and will benefit from their inclusion. Not a totally new concept, but I tend to agree that it is beneficial, not in that particular instance, but yeah.
Jillian or Victoria or Marg, any comments regarding supposed possible benefits for the classmates of the students with disabilities who are in their shared spaces?
Sure, I can. Oh, go ahead, Mark.
No, you go right ahead. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that when we look at the empirical research around inclusion, generally looking at it all overall, inclusion tends to either show no positive effects or beneficial effects. Rarely does it show to be detrimental to students. And there have been some studies that have looked specifically at other students in the classroom in terms of what they get out of being in an inclusive classroom. But what's interesting, when we did our qualitative research with teachers and with students in schools, one of the things that really struck us was how much students learn from other students, and the idea of putting students together in these heterogeneous groupings for activities or for projects, and how much students who were, supporting other students in those particular contexts gained from the experience of in that role, and also in terms of how much students who were seeking to their peers on particular issues for some support really benefited too from learning from each other, as opposed to just the educator in the front of the room. So, and research does back that up as well. So it was great to see.
Yeah, I'll just, I just agree in terms of that importance of that typical peers or neurotypical peers in classroom being part of that, the experience and having inclusion together. It's so important, both in terms of when you have kids who are more popular in a classroom, when they get actively involved, it can serve as a degree of protection, which has already been commented on. But there's also, we see kids, when we've produced videos to talk about autism in schools, the kids themselves, when they get to spend time and be genuine friends with kids who are autistic, they are their greatest defenders, and both, but not in a way that is a pitying approach, but really as someone, as to say, this is our classmate. And we've also had opportunities, and I've been in this field long enough to see when those friendships are genuine and really not just part of the school day, but outside the school day, that those can carry on into adulthood and I actually have examples of that, those kinds of stories. And that is so important for autistic children in particular, but also for neurotypicals to know who their neighbors are and what that means from a social justice lens in who belongs and who deserves to have access to the things that we all do. And if you're not in a classroom together and knowing and understanding the wide range of differences and abilities, that's going to be a lot harder to articulate as an adult when you are in the position to vote in a particular way or to think about public policy changes and who you value and what issues on human rights matter to all of us.
Yeah, I really second third what you're saying. I think the question is, what is the message when you don't include? That to me, and that's what I was partly trying to address in my comments tonight.
Thank you. Sorry, I got the note. Your internet connection is unstable. And so I'm sorry, Victoria, I just missed what you said, but I hope I'm going to go with the flow. And as I said, I'm going to invite you, if there are questions or comments amongst the panelists, this would be a great opportunity to hear your thoughts and reflections.
I have a question. I'd love to just jump in here, if that's okay. I think that when we talk about inclusion, one question that always burns for me, and I don't have an answer, but is the idea of like inclusion into what? So what are we asking students to be included into? And if we could shape those conditions within those classrooms so that they do support disability justice, like what would have to happen? I guess that's my question.
I think one of the things is that they need to see adults engaging with those students in ways that they experience themselves, so that those students are not seen as second-class citizens because they are getting additional supports or an approach that may be a little bit different than just being in a regular classroom. Because I do think that there are times when kids need to be out of the classroom to learn in a focused way. And that's not because they have a particular label, but because that's what they need to learn sometimes, that it's too hard to be in a class. We shouldn't operate from the assumption that a classroom of 25 kids is a good setting in which to learn. So what actually is that setting in which you need to learn best? And then inclusion, maybe we need just as much emphasis on what happens in a playground as we do in what happens in a learning environment. And I also think that we've seen some good research in autism when the kids themselves are involved in being taught how to engage their peers who are autistic and to be successful at it, to not abandon it, because we know that in social exchanges that unless you get a response pretty quickly, you abandon it because you figure I must be doing something wrong. But when you teach the kids how to do that successfully and say, try again, and encourage them, and they will see those responses, then they have success, and that empowers them to actually say, oh, this kid, it just takes a little bit more time, but doesn't mean they're either less intelligent, but that the way that they process information means I need to make changes. So the assumption we should be, as teachers, as educators, saying everybody has to give a little bit in how we interact with each other. So it's not just you need to learn how to be like me, but that we learn how to be with each other. And so when we teach the kids how to have success in engaging a wide range of kids and their abilities and their experiences, that is key to me in success, and seeing some research that supports that as well.
Yeah. I love that. I love that, Mark. I love what you said. Because I think that it's so true about that when we have inclusion that has a disability justice focus, is that it's not about assimilation, and that everyone looks at the sameness or has a sameness within the classroom, but that identity is celebrated. Yeah, I love that.
And I think also that it's nested within all these different all these differences. It's not just disability, but it is intersectional. I think we have to look with that broad lens and help others see with that broader lens that it's about difference. It's about our attitudes to difference, not just disability.
Absolutely.
Can I make sort of an imperfect historical analogy that puts this maybe in a different light? I think it does anyway. In 1954 in the United States, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that separate education for African-American children was inherently unequal. And so the next 15 to 20 years, where school districts acted on integration, which not all of them did and many did not, but where they did integrate, they closed Black schools and bused Black kids to white schools and integrated them into white schools and said, okay, we're integrating. And African-Americans rightfully and correctly said, integration doesn't just mean busing us into white schools. It also means valuing the institutions, that the separate institutions that Black schools were in the 13 states that had legally segregated ones. And it may also mean integrating white students into Black settings. That doesn't get talked about in inclusion with disability, and that's why it's an imperfect historical analogy. It's not the same thing, so I'm not making the argument it's the same thing. But I only know of one little tiny experiment in the Toronto Board of Education, I believe. It was one of the area boards anyway, but in the Toronto Board of Education, I'm fairly certain, in the mid-1980s, where there was a congregated class for so-called trainable retarded children, which was a term once used that would be somewhat analogous to children with exceedingly low measured IQs, where they were the majority in the class, and some regular or neurotypical children were integrated into that classroom. And it was an interesting experiment in integration that wasn't later repeated because the law changed. But when we think about, all that to say, when we think about inclusion and integration, what I hoped with my historical sort of example to show you was that there are different ways to think about educational justice. Educational justice does not just consist of putting children, exceptional children, in regular classrooms. It may consist of that in part. It may consist of that. It may mostly consist of that, but it cannot just consist solely of that. And the diversity of perspectives and policy suggestions that this panel is made already, I think, displays just how complex and complicated this topic can be, and that's a good thing because it brings a diversity and appropriateness of responses.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, we have, I have a question here. It is for for Marg. You called for a complete reexamination of support for students with autism. What would be the first step in this process?
To me, and not just for students with autism, but in spec ed, I think we need to take a really close look at how we've created the systems we have, which in some ways are enabling, but also barriers, the very spec ed systems that we have for our students. And one of the things I would say is to really take a close look at why we think about schools and education as the only place where other supportive professionals can't come in. And that there needs to be a better way for us to expand those walls out into community programs that take place before or after school, and that these are extensions of what it means to support children in their learning and their health and their mental health. And that we, by creating such rigidity around that over a long period of time, we do a disservice not only to the professionals who can support, but really looking at trying to rethink what does it mean, spec ed? What is special education? I say that having been a special education teacher in my training and growing up in the States. I really appreciate Jason's comments about that. I think in terms of autism, when sometimes with some of the public policy things that have changed and have had a focus on autism because we've seen such an explosion of the number of kids being diagnosed, I think some of those things have helped us to take a look at if we can help kids who have such a wide range of abilities, and because they happen to be called autistic, we sometimes can say, if this could work for this group of kids, maybe it could work for other kids. But right now, there are other kids who are not getting what they need because they don't have the right label. And so we're labeling. I mean, I remember in the 70s, we had this poster called Label Jars, Not People. I don't know if others of you probably remember that too. And just, it was a whole time where we were so against that. But now sometimes services are driven by those labels, and they shouldn't be. So I do think we need to take a look at that and really focus on that assessment process, and that there are more people who work in a team surrounding that child, and not that allows others to come in from external sources. But I also think we need to look at, there's already been so many times excellent recommendations given around autism that don't need to be repeated. However, we need a group to help implement them and to think about what does this mean for all of special education, not just autism. But I mentioned the report from the Ontario Autism Programs Advisory Panel from this past fall, not the most recent, but last year, 2019, that has an entire section on recommendations for education that I think needs to be there. That also include pre-service training and looking at how we train teachers to become good managers of themselves in classroom settings and of classrooms in general, and understanding those key roles and functions, and how environment plays a critical role in how kids with special needs respond to learning, and to find those places to do a good assessment and understanding of what are those variables that make a difference to that child's success or not.
Mark, you the first part of your comments especially hearken to a long, a historical conundrum that schools have faced going back all the way to Enoch Turner, which is that the reason we have public schools in the first place is that they can solve all of our social problems. And yet historically, while we expect schools to do that, we resolutely refuse to integrate them with communities. And every time that the school tries to expand, to allow people to use the building even after school, to bring in other professionals, someone will say, no, that's expanding the social agency of the school, and then that's too far. Schools are just about reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's a conundrum we've had for forever, and it's interesting to see it expressed that way. And I agree, it would be much better to see those services more seamlessly moving back and forth, even if they're not there in the same place.
Okay, thanks everyone. So we're getting towards the end of our time. So there's one question I'm going to pose to everybody here. And it's a recommendation that can each panelist comment on how the pandemic is affecting experiences and prospects of children with special needs.
I'll start. We did a survey, actually. We had we did a couple of surveys this year with the pandemic, and we immediately asked, especially parents who were anticipating sending their kids back to school after the summer break, and in a panic about that experience. And we asked them, what was school like for you before the pandemic for your child? What was it like during the time you were teaching your kids at home? And what are you worried about in terms of the transition? And the parents, their biggest concern had been the transition back to school. There were some parents who said this was the most horrible experience to have their children at home, and that there was simply no learning that occurred during the pandemic. Other parents made some really interesting comments, such as, this is the most I've ever spoken with my child's teacher was during the pandemic. And these are comments that came out in our survey. We had about 2,300 respondents across the province. And all of this information is on our website, and it is there for people to have a look at. And they said, you know what? This is the first I've learned something about how my child learns by having been involved in his education at home and being directly involved with his teacher on a more consistent basis, and not just through a how was Johnny's day book. So there was a real mix. 45% of the parents said the pandemic time was terrible and they wanted it never to be back again in terms of school and being in there. And there were parents who also said, if my child doesn't go to school, he's not going to learn. So right now we're seeing that impact. I mean, the kids are at risk. Many of the parents have no choice but to send their kids back to school because they can't, for a wide variety of reasons, educate their own children at home. So, and a vast majority of kids are not going to be able to do online learning. It's just not going to happen. And even the most able or savvy tech kids, their parents are leaning over them to have them be able to even complete some of the work, which is stressful for everybody. But yeah, there was a variety of responses. And like I said, it put a spotlight on some of the inequities that are currently present and that need to be addressed in this review of special education.
I can just share a little bit. I've just, as research is kind of coming out around COVID and learning at home, I've seen, just like Marg described, a real spectrum of experiences. There have been stories of parents who've had to leave their jobs in order to stay home and support their children. But there's also been stories in which students have been faring well because they're not having to navigate those other kind of ableist encounters at school. So yeah, I think we'll have to do a full review of when hopefully this ends soon, of really what's taking place and what we can learn from it in terms of moving forward, not in terms of K-12 education, but certainly I find at the post-secondary level, I've learned a lot in terms of how to make courses accessible and thinking about accessibility and prioritizing accessibility and embedding accommodations into courses that has been, really required of educators. So I hope that some of those learnings will be able to continue past COVID.
I'll just say that I can't speak for formal education, but certainly in terms of arts programming, for that, like, it's very difficult to do it all online, and especially with people who may not be able to type, may not read. There's some things that the Soul Express is doing, and I've been really impressed with how well they've managed to keep programming going. But it's very difficult.
I'm not speaking from the expertise that Jillian or Marg have or that Victoria has in arts. education specifically, but just, in general, as an educator, I'm worried. I think kids aren't learning, and that's worrying. That's very worrying to me. I was also very worried that we would graduate 750 new teachers at UBC, as we do every year, and they would not have spent any time in a classroom in practice teaching. Unfortunately, we were able to work with the government to rectify that so that they are doing practice teaching out in schools, as our schools are open at the moment. But if they hadn't been, that would have been extremely concerning to me. I don't even know if I would be comfortable allowing them to go out without that experience. We're losing a lot here. We're gaining and we're learning things, but we're losing a lot.
Okay, well, it's just after 8:30. So I'd like to thank everyone, to all our panelists. Thank you very much for really interesting presentations and for a very interesting conversation. And I'd like to thank all of our participants, all our guests here tonight that joined us and that submitted questions or just had some, and perhaps had some new thoughts. And I wish you all a very happy and safe evening. And I'd like to invite you to our next upcoming session of this Schoolhouse series. It's on January 19th. And it's called, Does Liberal Education Matter in the 21st Century? So I hope to see some of you that evening. And again, I wish you all the best and good night.